Welcome to Between Past and Future. I'm Rajdeep Desange.
And I'm Ethan Quinones. This is episode 0, where we're just going to introduce our podcast a little bit, talk about why we started it, and generally what we're going to do with it.
Yeah, so I'll go ahead and introduce myself. Like I said, my name is Rajdeep Desange. I got a BA from Bard College in Religious Studies, and I recently earned my MA from Cal State Long Beach, also in Religious Studies. And besides that, I've been working in education for about 3 years, starting out as a substitute teacher, making my way into the community college system.
I'm Ethan Quinones, and I attended Bard College for 3.5 years, and I spent one semester in Nicaragua, and I currently live in Brooklyn, and I am a bartender. So I'm definitely kind of removed from academia, but I'm still keeping up to date with various trends, reading articles, new books, etc. So I also come from I was a political studies student, so I tend to look at things from a more removed political analysis aspect as opposed to, for example, joining a cause. I'm kind of more interested in understanding the cause and what created it, where it's going, is it going to be successful? And Raj, you kind of are definitely more rooted in what would you say, religious?
Yeah, more of a religious or spiritual outlook. The idea of a lot of the world's issues stem from sort of immoral behavior rather than poor policy. Um, Although policy definitely has its place in making societies function better, but things like institutions being corrupt, you can lay that a lot on people's own lack of virtue, I believe.
Yeah, and I mean, to some extent, I do think lack of virtue is a problem, and there are sort of spiritual problems related to being happy once you get past policy problems. But I'm not a very spiritual person. And don't really follow any religious faith or believe in religion. So I definitely see the world as being more influenced by material causes and not necessarily just policy things, but material causes are the main issue at hand, and spiritual things are definitely more questions related to happiness, fulfillment. Those are definitely important, and you can see how when you're perfectly materially fulfilled, you still are not necessarily happy. So that means that we can't necessarily just look at policies and say, oh, if we fix society through creating the best possible policies, we're going to be totally happy and live in a utopia.
Right, and I don't discount the material world, right? Um, or material causality. I do think that America is what probably the richest material country in history. We do have large material inequalities, economic inequalities that need to be addressed, but um, lots of people in the U.S. are actually doing fine when it comes to their material conditions, but they're still not doing fine in their mental health or in their spiritual well-being, and that still causes them to cause problems in the society at large.
And we can kind of tie that into how we met at Bard in 2015. And this was after I had just taken a semester off to travel in Nicaragua and kind of get some perspective and distance from my first semester at college. And one thing we both noticed was that freshman year, going to college, going to people's dorm rooms, meeting a bunch of random people quickly, everyone's shifting friend groups. I noticed that I saw more prescription and illicit drugs than I'd ever seen in my entire life within a couple weeks, very quickly. And in regards to
Oh,
prescription drugs,
absolutely.
yeah, just a crazy amount. Drugs I'd never even heard of before. Um, and in terms of prescription drugs, people were very open, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but people were very open about mental health problems and what drugs they took, how they took them, what drugs they'd taken before, their whole history of what they've been prescribed. And combined with the amount of illicit drugs, and alcohol use, that seemed like a recipe for disaster. And there's definitely seemed to be, and people were by and large very materially wealthy. But I don't know about you, Raj, but I seem to see that a lot of the college did not seem to be particularly happy at all.
No, especially these kids who are coming from well-to-do families from New York City or Los Angeles. Um, that's not a value judgment against any of those kids. I was friends with a lot of those kids, but they were not happy people. And there seems to be some sort of correlation between people living in these large cities and being materially well off and being prescribed strong psychoactive medication to combat various anxiety disorders and things like that.
I think maybe in cities it might be more prevalent also because there's a greater access to mental health professionals or a greater chance that your parents are
Yeah,
classical. But also, I saw a trend in private schools, and their parents may have been from cities, but large, expensive, or even small, expensive private schools that had. I think there might be a sort of a cultural issue with elite or rich people, where prescription drugs and therapy is you can easily access it, and so that becomes a cure-all panacea for various problems. So if your children
right.
are poorly behaved, you need to give them Adderall medication. If your children are unhappy, you need to give them um, Ativan, or if they're anxious, you need to give them Xanax, etc. So
Right.
yeah,
There's almost this
cities,
assumption
but
that there's a sort of assumption that being not anxious and happy is the normal state of a human being, and I don't think that's the case.
yeah, and an expectation that you're going to be generally happy, safe, and comfortable. So as soon as you're not happy, safe, and comfortable, or if you're just not happy or not comfortable or don't feel safe, you're going to reach for pills, medication, um, cognitive therapy, maybe. And then that kind of ties into the general idea of college. You're going there to learn, and everyone has different ideas. They want to argue, talk about these ideas. There seemed to be a very hard ideology that people either brought with them or glommed onto very, very quickly related to questions of identity. Uh, and I don't know if you want to chime in, Raj. I don't know. If we're probably going to variously call it different things. Maybe woke ideology, or social justice mentality, social justice ideology, far left, new left ideology. But this general hyper focus on questions of identity related to race, sex, uh, gender
Those are the
identity.
big three.
Yeah, various forms, and mainly those three forms: race, gender, sexuality, sex, or three, four things, depending on how you divide them up. And people were very unwilling to debate these things. And part of it seemed to be that if you're talking about racism, nobody wants to be on the wrong side. Nobody wants to be seen as racist. So an easy thing to do is to kind of take a sort of radical perspective. Like, wow, slavery and racism were caused by white people. So I'm going to be openly critical as a white person of white men in history, and sort of say, "Oh, I don't read anything by old white people." This sort of reactive mentality, and part of it seemed to be formed as a defense mechanism, right? Not to be seen as racist, but another part of it seemed to be related to this desire to be special and different. To be part of a struggle, a historical struggle, being on the right side of history, and finally stopping this centuries trend of oppression of black people, women, uh, sexual minorities. I don't know what the new term is. LGBTQ plus IA people, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, and sort of this desire to make this radical break from history, which it seems almost as if the primary interpretive lens of history is that history is a story of oppression and the lessening of oppression over time. And because of that, there was a strong concerted effort to edit we have a great books program at Bard College called FISM, First Year Seminar. It's a great books program. And, we were taught books that would be found in most universities across the country when it comes to what we would consider the Western canon. You know, we start with the Bible and things like that, and then you end up somewhere in the end, but close to Freud. And there were throughout all 4 years there was always a concerted effort by the student body to make giant amendments to the FISM curriculum,
Yeah.
because the people who wrote the people who wrote the great books of the FISM curriculum, for the most part, were old, dead white men, and that was seen as inherently a bad thing.
Well, to back up one step, though, by the time we took FISM, this was not necessarily true. So the original FISM, if I'm not mistaken, I think Heinrich Blücher, who was a
Husband to Hannah Arendt.
yeah, Hannah Arendt's husband, he was a communist from Berlin who escaped and came to America. I don't think he ever even got a high school degree, but he was a college professor. And he created this course. And at the beginning, I think that could be largely true. I don't know, probably look it up, a specific list of the first FISM texts, but they were largely written or influenced by this sort of white Western European male person, right?
Oh yes, I'm not, just because the students were complaining that the FISM curriculum was filled with dead old white men doesn't mean that there wasn't actually an effort made by the faculty at Bard to amend the FISM curriculum. We had various texts in the FISM curriculum, such as we read things by Mary Wollstonecraft. We read a slave narrative by a man named Equiano. Um, there are definitely exceptions to the rule.
And part of why I'm saying this too is not just like, oh, there was diversity in it, but there was a concerted effort throughout the whole history of this course itself. So it wasn't a static, like Western Civ course where you read the same, you had the same 13 books that all students always read. It was being updated. And so one year you might have
Oh yes.
Arendt, one year you might have Wollstonecraft. And part of the problem too is seeing someone like St. Augustine as a white man when he was from North Africa. And he lived in a time before our current racial categories existed. So there was a real concentrated belief that you could look at history through these identity lenses of race, gender, and
Which are contemporary lenses.
yeah, and they go like the contemporary views on gender. You could trace them back to ancient Rome, but then they've also fluctuated up and down and gone here and there. There isn't a straight line of the way that we look at women hasn't changed one bit since 0 AD or BCE, and the same thing with race. If you want to look at a list of authors from the last 1,000 years and say they're all from one small part of the world, so they're all white men, one circle on the map, you could kind of say that, but you're missing out on a broad diversity in the fact that they weren't actually white men at that time. And even if you were a white man, that wouldn't necessarily mean you're at the top of the pecking order or top of the hierarchical order in every society.
And also, to your point about this was something that was always being updated. I believe it was every 3 years, a team of 2 faculty members would be put in charge of redesigning the FISM curriculum. So while we were there, the FISM curriculum that we had was created by 2 professors. I'm not going to name them. One is a self-described radical feminist Marxist, and both of these professors were under the impression that what they had put forth in the FISM curriculum that we were exposed to was one of the most radical FISM curriculums that had been put together. So they thought that the inclusion of St. Augustine was radical. One professor wanted it to be City of God, but he figured most students weren't going to be reading an 800-page tome by Augustine. But there's important decisions that were made. Like, we read more Rousseau than we read Locke. We did read both of them, but Rousseau was, I think, probably also there's discretion from each faculty member and how they teach it. I happened to take it with one of the designers of the curriculum, and there was a emphasis on Rousseau over Locke. And so there's these little sort of decisions like that happen in every classroom, but The idea that this was a conservative world great the idea that this was a conservative great books program is certainly not the case.
And there's also the idea of a common core group of texts that you have, texts that all the freshmen read. If you update it every 3 or 4 years, I have no problem with that. But constantly trying to update it, you do lose a common thread. So if teachers are used to students having read Das Kapital, they won't have to go into a 4 or 5 minute explanation on the chalkboard about it, when they start off a conversation. And they might choose that book knowing that all the freshmen read it at a certain point. So I'm not saying you need to have the same books forever, but keeping certain core texts in it creates a sort of college climate where you can bring up a common text in any class and tie it back to something, and you can reasonably know that most students in the class will have read that. And that idea was completely forsaken in the name of identity politic diversity. And even though there was diversity in the curriculum, students were much more interested in injecting texts that they thought should be taught by the professors. So, for example,
Right.
one big one was autobiography of Malcolm X. I don't know if it actually ended up getting added to the course or if it was in the course at some point, but and I have no problem with it being in there. But it's interesting that people would spend so much time instead of reading it or taking a class where the book is read or proposing a class where you read books like that. They wanted to add it to the course list without really being understanding how it was constructed or really caring. And that was more alarming, really, than the idea of changing it or adding text or even completely just making it all about Malcolm X. The idea that people just wanted to change it for the sake of changing it.
Right. I didn't see a lot of defense for the diversity that was already found in these texts. For example, we went through Confucian Analects. We went through we had a compendium of Chinese philosophy that we went through, and we also had a text by a um, Islamic scholar, Ibn Tufayl. So the idea that we weren't exposed to um, either different cultures or non-Western ways of thinking, it just was false on its face. One of the issues is with a lot of kids actually just didn't even read the books. But
Yeah,
that's a digression.
even a more practical issue. The FISM courses were taught by professors from various different disciplines. And so if you have a text that's kind of a more stereotypical dead white man book, there's a higher likelihood, especially since the history of education is what it is, and these texts have been taught before, that if you pluck a random professor from a social science division, they'll be able to talk about it. And one argument that people would make is that, trying to teach about a culture that you're not from or very, very familiar from is actually offensive. So if you had added a text about, if you'd added a Native American text, for example, something from Iroquois or Sioux people, there might have been an argument that, oh, this German guy is actually not teaching it the right way, and that's racist. So that you're kind of always in this catch-22 with that mentality. Is if you make the course completely diverse, and every single text is from someone that checks off certain identity boxes, there's then going to be another argument about, oh, the professors teaching it actually aren't very diverse, and they
Right.
can't handle teaching this material.
But this is just a small part of the broader issues at Bard. Um, Ethan and I also saw in our time there, coming from the most radical students, was the idea that the time for discourse had ended, the time for dialogue had ended, and that this wasn't a very broad idea, but it was out in the culture. But the idea that now violence was the road to further political action had it was relevant enough where people were talking about it and organizing around it and using social media to promote the idea.
If you're on a very small campus and its population is generally liberal or left-leaning, and Bard was very, very left-leaning liberal. I would say probably 80 to 90% of students would identify as liberal or left-leaning, depending on exactly how you ask the question. And that sets the conditions for people to become more and more radical very quickly. If you're in an event where everyone agrees, like a rally, for example, you're going to have to keep saying things that are more and more entertaining, that are going to capture people's attention. And so going from saying, hey, we need more diversity at this college is not going to grab people's attention over time. So you're going to start using words like revolution and force by any means necessary. And there wasn't any actual violence that I can remember. That went on maybe like one time somebody
Not
threw.
any politically motivated violence. There was a
Yeah,
couple of
no,
fights, but that was, personal beefs.
yeah. I think like maybe one time someone threw something during a march, maybe. But even then, I don't think it was at anyone or at anything. And that would be the most extreme thing. I would like somebody, throwing an apple into a tree or something. Um, but the rhetoric was there, and if you confronted someone about it or asked them about it or questioned it, there was this tone of urgency. So they'll be like, they might not even defend themselves so much, but say, that's all well and good, but we have to do something now, 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 now. And even though Bard was a very, very safe place, there was this idea of microaggressions becoming popular. And so the smallest sort of slight or social miscue could be taken as evidence of a racially charged climate and of actually white supremacy in many cases.
Regardless of the intent of the person making the social faux pas.
Yeah, an intent, if you said intent, that was almost like a wink and a nod type thing, right? So if you said, well, I don't think anyone intended it to be racist, people would very quickly say, oh, well, intent doesn't matter. That's kind of a urban myth almost, right? It's really the effect. So if someone thinks it's racist, then it is racist. If someone
Right.
feels it's sexist, it is sexist. And that quickly becomes it's a recipe for disaster, because anytime something bad happens to you, you're immediately going to start to think, was it because of my identity? And people are going to not hold the door open for you. People are going to be mean to you. People are not going to not like you. Some professors aren't going to call on you all the time, or some professors might be rude to you and not pronounce your name properly. And when you see that as evidence of uh, white supremacist culture, which is the language people really use, you're going to be unhappy, and it's going to create a self-fulfilling prophecy of unhappiness and unrest. And combined with this desire for change by any means necessary, you kind of have a dangerous thing going on.
Right, and there was a sort of a climate of paranoia on campus. Even, I mean, at first when you're exposed to this stuff, I never jived with it for very long, but when things are being introduced to you and most of the people seem to agree with it, it's kind of difficult to recognize the contradiction on its face. That was one of the things that the friendship with Ethan actually helped a lot. We were able to sort of confirm each other's um, reality. We were both able to say, this is kind of very odd what's happening here. But even sort of, I'm a Indian person, Punjabi person, so I'm racialized, as some people would say, and even if you don't believe it, it is such a pervasive way of thinking on campus that it does start to seep into even my thinking to a degree, and it leads to a sort of paranoia about people. You don't trust people, and it's not a healthy way of looking at the world. At least it wasn't for me when I was noticing it seeping into my worldview.
And it starts out really from a place of the best intentions, right? So you have young kids going to college, especially in a time of political uncertainty when there was very real racism against the president. So arrived at Bard in the fall of 2013. Obama had just been reelected, but there's all of this. He'd been called Muslim, that he's born in Africa. There was this unwillingness to compromise or work with anyone had set in, and so there was real questions and worries about racism and sexism as Donald Trump especially emerged. But the way that people dealt with them, it a lot of times didn't actually end up turning out to be very noble. So, you go from wanting to deal with racism and you realize that if you say certain things, especially if you exaggerate a sense of victimhood, you're going to get to give a talk, you're going to get attention, you can become the head of a club. And so there was an incentive that turned people with largely good intentions to kind of be almost little despots in a certain sense, right? With like rules about various activities and what you could do and say.
Right, there was a person who had they were a part of one of the clubs on campus that had to do with media. So they're kind of like an AV club. And so this person was put in charge of one of the musical venues on campus. And it was a show that was, it bordered on the punk, like a punk show. So it was aggressive kind of dancing that was going on, bordering on moshing. And this person who was in charge of the venue said, "You guys aren't allowed to dance." They tried to impose a ban on dancing, um, but then there's a strange. They put a ban on dancing because it was threatening and triggering. And next week, you see the same person who is acting like a little despot at the music venue dancing at a different music venue on campus.
It was a small underground space that was in a basement, and it was usually held punk shows or some sort of punk-related music. So dancing was generally aggressive, but this was not, sort of like people moshing at a wide-open normal concert. This was a place that typically had this sort of thing. So you could see how that might cause a problem. And they decided to put a ban on dancing because of this, right? It's aggressive moshing music, which kind of goes against the punk culture that Bard had associated and what created this space in the first place. So it was like a cultural shift towards safety versus um, liberty, freedom, be able to do what you want. And some people might defend that and say, oh, you shouldn't be aggressively moshing in a basement at a college when people are drinking. But then the same person who made the rule wasn't just dancing, they were aggressively dancing. The same way that they had previously decried as not just being dangerous, but immoral.
Right. And this is something that Ethan and I picked up on talking to various alumni who would come on and off of campus, and that there's always that since the 60s, every graduating class has said that the class coming out of them has been more lame and more tame. That's probably a similar sentiment across college campuses. I don't know, but there was definitely this emphasis that older alum made that Bard is becoming more and more tame. That Bard is becoming more and more sanitized, kind of like New York City. How people describe like how New York City used to be in the '70s, and even though it was a very dangerous and dingy place, there's like a romanticism about it. It seems to be a similar kind of image, romantic image of Bard in the past.
I do think it's a larger trend with colleges, right? Because it's becoming more and more expensive to run colleges and the type of amenities you're expected to have. So Bard typically, throughout its history, did not have great dorms or a lot of sports teams or the sort of amenities that larger, plushier colleges did. And that was kind of its appeal, that it was grungy and that you lived right next to the edge of the woods, and the walk to school is going to be either it's going to be ticks everywhere or there's going to be ice and snowstorms. That kind of was the appeal of it. But over time, the alumni that graduated weren't donating enough money. So they started to run low on money. This is at least the story that I heard. And so they had to reach out to more and more students. And as time went on, it turned out there's fewer and fewer students who want to live in a grimy dorm at the edge of the woods and take classes outside when it's raining. And people wanted more structure. And so it was coming from the students a lot of times. But then there's also the administration. It's not the 1970s. You can't have kids running around unsupervised drinking. There's a lot of insurance and liability issues at play now. So in the past, if someone got hurt, it's like, wow, that person's being dumb. And now if someone gets hurt, that could be a lawsuit against the college. So there's also a concerted effort by the administration to say, hey, we've got to kind of shape up and make this place more kind of sanitized from almost like an HR perspective.
Yeah, that gets that brings up a whole bunch of issues such as the bloating of the administrative staff. The amount of administrators we had on campus was pretty astounding, and there were all these kind of HR types. Although not all of them, some of them were people you could have a pretty regular conversation with.
Yeah, and it seemed that some people kind of acknowledged that they were useless administrators to a degree. And
Yeah, I mean, definitely some of the deans.
yeah, and yeah, that's a whole other conversation. But that was definitely one aspect of it. Was you have a dean of equity and inclusion, so there's constantly going to be questions about equity and inclusion. So when you go into school and you look at the bulletin board of activities, there's going to be equity and inclusion, improving the racial climate at Bard poster, right? And you thought, well, is there racism at Bard? So it's like another one of those self-fulfilling prophecies. All these deans who have work to do, of course, they're going to look for problems to solve. That's why they're there, right?
Right, they're trying to do their job. It just turns out there's not actually that much of a job for them to do. So their solution is to go find problems, which makes it seem like their job can be justified.
And encourage students that, to some degree, you don't want students getting in fights, right? So encouraging students to go to an authority figure to solve a dispute. But when it gets to a level of, my roommate took my towel and used it, and I feel unsafe in my dorm now, so I need to go to the dean's office and have some tea and skip a couple classes. That seems to just be the opposite of what college is supposed to be about.
Yeah, that's certainly not fostering independence and interpersonal communication skills. All right, I think that leads us pretty well, actually, into closing with the 2 hour quotes that we have.
Yeah, so do you want to read yours and then I'll read mine, and then we can talk about both of them?
Yeah. So the Arendt quote that I have is, every generation, civilization is invaded by barbarians. We call them children.
And the quote I have is, to believe that such a society will become more cultured as time goes on and education has done its work is, I think, a fatal mistake. So I guess the first, they're loosely connected through this thread of becoming cultured and education, and an idea of children being barbarians. So in society, generally, each new generation makes some sort of new truth or changes the way that things are, right? So every generation is going to produce a new generation of people that are in some sense barbarians to them because they want to change society in some radical foreign way. And to some degree, the next generation is going to be different and want to change things in such a way that makes them completely divorced from the world of the previous generation. That's why they're generations. There's a constant flux and change going on.
Yeah, and I think that this actually does have a lot to do with morality and ethics. Um, we hear a lot of discussion about things being morally wrong, racism being a morally bad thing, but when you take down morality and ethics to their old, I believe, Latin root for morals and Greek root for ethics, both of them just have to do with sort of habits, like a more or a custom. These are things that get repeated over time. And if children are trying to radically change behavior, or they're behaving in a radically different way, morality and ethics is going to go by the wayside, because we, we can make all sorts of philosophical discussions about what is right and what is wrong. And I think there's a lot of use to that. But there's also just the practical matter of how people act in their day-to-day life. And a lot of people, I know quite a few people who will never seriously engage with a conversation about morality, in terms of going to a class and doing it in a very formal sense. They might do it in a more casual way with family members or friends, but when students start acting, or when children start acting in a way that is meant to just be different, they're acting in a way to sort of bring out their uniqueness, they are actually undermining the mores and customs of a society. And this might be my conservatism coming out, and you probably disagree, Ethan, but yeah, just being different for the sake of being different, I think, is a recipe for disaster as to the sustainability of a civilization across time.
I think it has more to do with the degree of difference and change in the next generation. So if you just have subsequent clones of generations going forward, that's not really civilization. Civilization is marked by growth and progress and change. A static way of
The
doing
Egyptians
things.
were very similar for a very long time.
Yeah, but did they not change their way of, was where each generation worshipped, did each generation worship the same gods, or try to control the floods of the Nile the same way?
For
So
hundreds of
they,
years, yeah.
but I think each generation had these subtle differences and changes. And so, like, from the god that King Tut said was the top god, Amun Ra was the different top god than the
Right.
next
They're not going to
pharaoh.
be exact clones, but in terms of maybe like 85% of their behavior, I would say it's probably pretty similar.
So, if you get to a degree where your behavior is sustainable and you don't really have to change much, and you can keep on, doing fine and being successful, sure, maybe for a period of time there isn't much flux, but when things do change, which inevitably happens, a new group comes along, or the course of the river changes, or you discover a new technology, society is going to change. And to the degree at which it changes, and the speed and why you change it and how you change it, those are all important questions. So Arendt talks about a complete break with tradition in terms of totalitarianism. If the new generation completely breaks with the moral traditions and way of living, I think that's very dangerous. It's not necessarily going to lead to totalitarianism, but that creates a dangerous vacuum where you don't have anything to ground yourself on or rely upon.
Right.
But in
And
the
that's
same
sort of
sense,
what,
if you don't grow, that can be even worse. If you don't realize that racism is wrong and we need to end slavery and then try to reduce racism over time, you're going to live in a racist society forever.
right. And I'm not saying that we should not change like the Egyptians. The Egyptians they had a much more stagnant environment than we do. And our environment is changing rapidly, mostly because of our own hands. The technological changes our society has gone through in the last 10 years alone have been staggering, let alone the changes that have happened from the previous generation to ours on a scale of about 20 to 30 years. So I'm not saying that we shouldn't change, but I do think that change for the sake of change is, change for the sake of change is overrated. And you should be changing in a manner in a matter that is actually reflective of helping you navigate the environment.
Yeah, no, I don't think that society should be in a constant state of change just for the sake of change. And that would actually seems to be an aspect of totalitarianism and constant movement. And to some degree, that's what we saw happening at Bard in the little bubble, is that
Right.
you have an institution that is constantly trying to change the curriculum, the way they do things, their admissions policies, their housing policies, all sorts of different things in an effort to be more. And I don't know about the entire history of Bard, definitely not the entire history, but in the last 10, 15, 20 years, there's been an emphasis on diversity and inclusion and tolerance, various things like that. Each generation of students wants to change things regardless of how diverse or tolerant or good they are. And the fact that people would go to Bard and come to the conclusion that it was a dangerous white supremacist institution, that seems to be people trying to change things for the sake of changing things. And then you
Right.
kind of become barbarians. You you're not relying on any sort of tradition. In a certain sense, if you actually are in a white supremacist institution, I think being a barbarian might be a good thing, tearing down the institution and trying to build a better institution. But if you're at an institution where you actually have the tools to change the problems that exist, and there aren't actually many problems related to race, it doesn't seem,
And
from our perspective.
you have a highly accommodating administrative class on campus.
Yeah, and people are falling over themselves to try to accommodate various requests for diversity, inclusion, tolerance, clubs, etc. But instead of saying, okay, let's use these tools and try to accomplish things, people just want to tear stuff down.
Yeah. I think that that is exactly the problem that we saw.
And the prescription that Arendt has is kind of, or if she does prescribe anything, really is thinking and reflection is an antidote to totalitarianism. And so, kind of stopping and thinking can help you will help you avoid the temptation to join in, for example, of a mob. If there's a mob saying, hey, this guy, uh, this guy is a pedophile, we're going to go to his house and we're going to run him out of town, and if we catch him, we're going to hang him. At first, you're like, hey, a pedophile? I'm going to get in your mom. Go hang this guy. He did something bad. But then you think, hey, there's no evidence he did that. What if they're wrong? Suddenly, the mob does not seem like a thing you want to join. I think that's kind of good analogy for what we're trying to do here is almost like, hey, there's a mob forming. Why is it forming? Is it doing a good thing? Are they using their energies for good? Or is this going to become a chaotic, let's tear everything down and burn everything down type situation?
Right. Is this the time where we want to let the barbarians burn down the institutions and try and build them back up? Or should we not mob up so quickly?
Yeah, and also I think there's better ways to fix a lot of institutions than just burning them down and building a new one. So for example, if you have a poorly performing school district, and let's say even 10 to 20% of the teachers are bad, uh, ill-meaning people, they're racist, they're sexist, they're just bad apples. The rest teachers are fine, but there's some bad apples in there. If you say, all right, we're going to defund the school system and we're going to instead invest in a whole bunch of other things in order to get rid of this problem, we're going to invest in after-school programs, we're going to invest in pre-K, etc. You've actually ended up worsening the problem you're trying to fix. When you look at the sort of mob mentality forming around defunding the police, even if you agree with what they want to achieve, they're not going to achieve it with these methods. If you want to solve a problem like the New York City Police Department being racist or being overly aggressive, you're going to have to spend money. Even if you reduce the budget over time, or even if you reduce the number of officers, disarm them, you solving problems by just tearing something down and punishing them and taking money away is not actually a very liberal, progressive thing. And the urge to join the mob makes sense. There's videos all over of police doing horrible things. And throughout the protest, more and more videos are emerging from the past and from happening in live time of police shooting, what are they called, rubber bullets at people on their porches, people getting batoned by the police, people getting pepper sprayed who are in wheelchairs, all sorts of things. Um, so it makes sense to want to join the mob and say, hey, we need to defund the police. But that would actually kind of seem to worsen the problem. If you're going to take money and away from people and make them angry and attack them and shame them, it doesn't seem very likely that they become better police any more than a school that's underperforming that has its budget slashed and programs taken away would.
Yeah, I think that's a good way of tying it to the present moment. But yeah, what we're gonna try and do here is think and reflect on what's going on in society and what we have gone through in our own lives. And this is between past and future. Anything else, Ethan?
I think that's mostly it. And we're going to do guest interviews, and there's a whole About Us section where you can read more in depth about it. But the guest interviews are largely going to be people we can get on the show who will agree to be on the show, but also we're going to try and find outsider interesting perspectives. So people who, maybe someone who voted for Obama twice and then Trump, maybe someone who thinks that Trump is a white supremacist, maybe someone who believes in QAnon. Interesting people. We're generally going to try and stay away from wackos and people who don't have much merit. Just loudmouth fools, because there's plenty of those around. But maybe someone who's actually has a
Anyone
law
who's
degree.
willing to have an actual conversation with us and who is going to have the same commitment to thinking and reflecting, I think is fair game.
Yeah, like someone who has a law degree from Harvard who believes in QAnon. That's the kind of person I want to talk to.
Yeah. So I guess that's it. That's episode 0. You got a rough idea of who we are now. And in addition to the investigative podcast that we do and the interview podcast, we'll also be posting articles on the website. That's at betweenpastandfuture.com.
Yeah, and there's going to be a general page for each episode. We'll have a list of links, and then there's going to be a general link page where you can find all sorts of interesting articles and oddities.
Yeah. Well, what do you think about both of us putting together a reading list, like a list of essential books that you think are essential, and I can put together a list of essential books that I think are essential?
I was thinking kind of doing like a reading list and an anti-reading list. So like one is a list of books you should read, and one is a list of books you shouldn't read.
Like white
And
fragility.
yeah, I would put that in the books you shouldn't read category. I would say that
It's bad for you if you read it.
yeah, yeah, it's like Mein Kampf. If you're going to study, that specific time period in history and write an essay about it, yeah, maybe you should read it. But in general, reading a review of it will probably get you all you need to know. And
Yeah.
but otherwise, I don't. It's not a banned book. There's going to definitely be sort of a corollary, like don't read this unless. So don't read White Fragility unless it was assigned to you in class and you want to accurately debate it. But yeah, maybe something like that. Maybe we should just do a reading list, because anti-reading list sounds a little totalitarian.
Yeah, I guess it does. All right. That's the end of episode 0. Bye, guys.
See ya.
Like we came from outer space, but Betty knows I waited for the alien, okay? Chalk it up to destiny, the rest of me's you, like a pretty little rabbit chilling on the moon. I won't break the arcade game before the flash that makes the black heart taste the lash. I won't disclose the future except for what I know. Tell the radio and television to tell the show. I saw the alien, okay. I saw the peace sign, November break of day. I saw the alien, okay. Shining in the sky, November break of day. The dead endeavor, happiest rabbit ever, within the cosmic blessing of love and energy. Drums to space, you know this is the place. Our heart and soul has saved the human race. Could it be that we truly know the score? 'Cause my alien friends say we ended the war. A bloody battle, an interstellar fight. Somehow we did it, victory of the light. But I won't break the arcade game before the flash that makes the black heart taste the lash. I won't disclose the future except for what I know. Till the radio and television do tell the show. I saw the alien, okay. I saw the peace sign, remember break of day. I saw the alien, okay. Shining in the sky, November break of day. The peace sign in November break of day. I saw the alien, okay. Shining in the sky, November break of day. I saw the alien, okay. I saw the peace sign too, okay. shining in the sky, November break of